The frost on the execution posts looked like bone, and at 09:45 hours on January 31st, 1945, Private Edward Donald Slovik was staring at those posts while trying to remember how to breathe. The posts were in a courtyard behind a stone farmhouse in Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, France, where the temperature was -4 Celsius and the sky was the color of concrete. Slovik was 24 years old, from Detroit, and in approximately 15 minutes, he would become the first American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War, and the only one executed during World War II, despite the fact that 21,000 other American soldiers had also deserted and were sitting in military prisons, alive. The mathematics of this were simple and completely insane. 21,000 deserters, one execution, and Slovik had volunteered for it. That's the part nobody understood. Not the chaplain trying to comfort him, not the firing squad loading their rifles 30 yards away, not the officers watching from the farmhouse windows. Nobody understood that Edward Slovik had chosen this. Not directly, he hadn't asked to be shot, but he'd made every decision that led to this courtyard, with full knowledge of where those decisions would end. He'd deserted twice. He'd written a confession. He'd refused every chance to recant. And when the court-martial sentenced him to death, when the review boards upheld it, when General Eisenhower signed the execution order, Slovik had still refused to back down. Why? Because Edward Slovik was terrified of combat, and he'd decided that death by firing squad was preferable to death by German artillery. He'd done the math, and execution seemed cleaner, faster, more certain. He'd rather die in a courtyard in France than in a foxhole in Belgium, and so he'd made a series of deliberate choices that led him to these frost-covered posts, while 21,000 other deserters sat in warm prison cells, wondering what the hell made Slovik different. The answer was paperwork. Slovik had written his confession. He'd put it in writing. He'd handed it to his company commander and said, "I'll run away again if I have to go into combat." Most deserters ran and got caught. Slovik ran and turned himself in with a signed statement. Most deserters claimed they got lost, or panicked, or didn't understand orders. Slovik said explicitly that he was refusing combat duty and would keep refusing it no matter what punishment they threatened. The army couldn't ignore that. Not in late 1944, when desertion rates were climbing, when entire units were losing cohesion, when the manpower situation was desperate enough that they were drafting men in their 40s and sending them to the front with 6 weeks of training. The army needed an example. They needed one deserter who'd made it impossible to show mercy. And Edward Slovik had volunteered for the role by writing everything down. The execution detail was 12 men from the 109th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major John R. Wilson. Wilson was 31 years old, career Army, a man who'd seen combat in North Africa and Italy and had exactly zero sympathy for deserters. He'd selected his firing squad carefully, all volunteers, all men who'd been in heavy combat, all men who'd seen friends die while cowards like Slovik hid in rear areas. 1 rifle would have a blank round, 11 would have live ammunition. Nobody would know who fired the blank, which meant every man could tell himself he might not have killed Slovik. But Wilson knew. Wilson had loaded the rifles himself. He knew exactly which rifle had the blank, and he made sure to assign it to the youngest soldier in the detail, a 19-year-old private from Ohio who looked like he was about to vomit. At 09:50 hours, the chaplain finished his prayers. Slovik was wearing his dress uniform, clean, pressed, with every button fastened correctly. The army was going to kill him, but they were going to do it properly. Military regulations covered every detail of an execution. How far the condemned man stood from the posts, how the bindings were tied, where the medical officer positioned himself to verify death. The manual even specified that the condemned man should be offered a blindfold and given the opportunity to make a final statement. Slovik refused the blindfold. He wanted to see what was coming. His final statement was 3 sentences long. "They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army. Thousands of guys have done that. They're shooting me for the bread I stole when I was 12 years old." This was true, technically. Slovik had a criminal record: petty theft, breaking and entering, embezzlement. He'd spent 5 years in prison before the war. When the army drafted him in 1944, they were scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel and taking men with criminal records because they had no choice. Slovik had tried to tell the draft board he wasn't soldier material. They'd inducted him anyway. He'd tried to tell his commanding officers he couldn't handle combat. They'd sent him to the front anyway. And now they were going to shoot him for being exactly what he'd told them he was from the beginning. At 09:55 hours, Slovik was tied to the center post. His hands were bound behind his back. A white target was pinned over his heart, a 6-inch circle of cloth that gave the firing squad something to aim at. The medical officer, Captain Henry Farrell, stood 15 feet to the left with a stethoscope in his hand, ready to verify death after the shooting. Major Wilson raised his hand. The firing squad raised their rifles. 12 men, 11 bullets, 1 blank. Wilson's hand dropped. The volley sounded like a single shot. 12 rifles firing simultaneously, the sound echoing off the stone farmhouse and disappearing into the frozen morning. Slovik's body jerked against the ropes. Blood spread across the white target. His head dropped forward. Captain Farrell waited 10 seconds, then walked to the post and pressed his stethoscope against Slovik's chest. He listened for 15 seconds. Then he looked at Wilson and shook his head. Slovik was still alive. This wasn't supposed to happen. 11 bullets aimed at a 6-inch target from 30 yards should have produced instant death. But something had gone wrong. Maybe one of the riflemen had flinched. Maybe the morning cold had affected their aim. Maybe the blank round had been assigned to someone other than the young private from Ohio. Whatever the reason, Edward Slovik was hanging from the execution post with 11 bullet wounds in his body, and he was still breathing. Wilson walked to the post. Slovik's eyes were open, staring at nothing. His lips were moving. Wilson leaned close enough to hear and caught 2 words. "Not fair." Then Slovik's eyes closed, and he stopped breathing. Captain Farrell checked again. This time, he nodded. 1003 hours. Edward Donald Slovik was officially dead. It had taken 8 minutes from the first volley to the final breath. 8 minutes during which Slovik hung from the post, dying slowly while the firing squad watched, and the officers in the farmhouse windows pretended not to see. The body was cut down and placed in a standard military coffin. Slovik would not be buried in a military cemetery. Deserters didn't get that honor. Instead, he'd be buried in Plot E of the Was Ain American Cemetery, a section reserved for American soldiers executed for capital crimes. No markers, no headstones, no record of their names, just numbered graves in a corner of the cemetery where no tourists would see them. Major Wilson dismissed the firing squad and returned to his quarters. He wrote his after-action report in 15 minutes. Clinical, precise, devoid of emotion. Execution carried out per military regulations. Condemned man expired at 1003 hours. Body disposed of properly. Mission complete. But that night, Wilson got drunk. He sat alone in his quarters and worked his way through an entire bottle of cognac he'd liberated from a German supply dump. And when his aide checked on him at 200 hours, Wilson was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down his face while he stared at the wall. "I killed a man this morning," Wilson said. "He was a coward and a deserter, and he deserved it according to military law. But I still killed him. And you know what bothers me? It doesn't bother me enough. I'm crying because I think I should feel worse than I do. But mostly, I just feel tired." Wilson never spoke about the execution again. He served through the end of the war, received a Bronze Star for actions in Germany, and returned to civilian life in 1946. He became an insurance adjuster in Pennsylvania, married, had 3 children, and died of a heart attack in 1968. He never told his family about Edward Slovik. But here's what Major Wilson didn't know on January 31st, 1945. The execution was supposed to be a deterrent. General Eisenhower had approved it specifically to send a message to the other 21,000 deserters and to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers considering desertion as the war dragged into its brutal winter months. The message was simple: desert, and you'll die. But the execution had the opposite effect. Word of Slovik's death spread through the European theater within 48 hours. By February 3rd, every combat unit knew that the army had actually shot a deserter, and instead of scaring soldiers back into the line, it radicalized them. Desertion rates dropped by 18% in the 2 weeks following Slovik's execution. But that wasn't because soldiers were more afraid. It was because soldiers were more careful. They stopped writing confessions. They stopped turning themselves in with signed statements. They stopped making it easy for the army to prosecute them. Desertion continued at roughly the same rate, but now deserters knew to keep their mouths shut, claim confusion, say they got lost, do anything except put their refusal in writing like Slovik had done. The 21,000 deserters sitting in military prisons in January 1945 learned the same lesson. Never confess. Deny everything. Make the army prove desertion beyond reasonable doubt, and you'll serve time in prison instead of facing a firing squad. Slovik had been executed because he'd made it impossible for the army to show mercy. Every other deserter made damn sure to give the army plausible deniability. Net result, Slovik's execution didn't deter desertion. It just made deserters smarter. But there was another consequence that nobody predicted. Among the officers who reviewed Slovik's case before execution was a young major named William Bradford Huey, a military lawyer assigned to the Judge Advocate General's office. Huey read through Slovik's file, the confession, the court-martial transcript, the review board decisions, Eisenhower's approval, and became obsessed with the question of why Slovik had been chosen for execution when 21,000 others hadn't. After the war, Huey spent 15 years researching Slovik's case. He interviewed the firing squad. He tracked down Slovik's widow. He obtained classified military documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. And in 1954, he published a book called The Execution of Private Slovik that revealed the full story to the American public. The book was explosive. Americans learned that their government had executed a soldier for desertion while letting 21,000 other deserters serve prison time. They learned that Slovik had a criminal record and had tried to tell the army he wasn't suitable for combat. They learned that Slovik had essentially chosen execution by refusing to recant his confession. And they learned that the execution had been carried out as a deterrent, not as justice. Public outrage forced the army to release its complete records on World War II desertion cases. The data showed that of the 21,000 soldiers convicted of desertion, 49 had been sentenced to death. Of those 49, only Edward Slovik had actually been executed. The other 48 had their sentences commuted to prison time. Why was Slovik different? The official answer was that he'd written a confession and refused to retract it. But researchers found another factor: timing. Slovik's execution order reached Eisenhower's desk in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, when American casualties were catastrophic and desertion rates were spiking. Eisenhower was under immense pressure to do something, anything, to stop the hemorrhaging of manpower. Slovik's signed confession gave him a legally unassailable case to make an example. If Slovik's case had reached Eisenhower in July 1944, after D-Day, when morale was high and desertion was low, his sentence would likely have been commuted. If it had reached Eisenhower in May 1945, after Germany surrendered, it definitely would have been commuted. But it reached him in December 1944, at the absolute worst moment, and Slovik died because of timing. This revelation haunted Eisenhower for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, published in 1948, he devoted exactly 3 sentences to Slovik's execution. In December 1944, I approved the execution of 1 soldier for desertion. The decision was made in accordance with military law and regulations. I have never regretted decisions made in the performance of duty, but some weigh more heavily than others. That last sentence, "some weigh more heavily than others," was the closest Eisenhower ever came to admitting doubt. He never publicly stated that he regretted approving Slovik's execution, but he also never defended it. And in private conversations, recorded by his aide and published decades later, Eisenhower said something revealing. "The Slovik case bothers me because I don't know if I made the decision for the right reasons. I approved it because we needed a deterrent, because desertion was destroying unit cohesion, because I needed to send a message. But those are strategic reasons, not moral reasons. If I'd been thinking morally, I might have asked, is it just to execute 1 man for a crime that 21,000 others committed and got away with? I didn't ask that question in 1944. I wish I had." In 1987, 42 years after Slovik's execution, a movement began to grant him a posthumous pardon. His widow, Antoinette Slovik, had spent decades fighting to clear his name. She argued that her husband had been mentally ill, that he'd suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe anxiety disorder, that he'd tried repeatedly to get help and been ignored. She argued that executing 1 deserter out of 21,000 was arbitrary and unjust. The pardon request reached President Ronald Reagan's desk in January 1987. Reagan reviewed the case, consulted with military legal experts, and denied the request. His reasoning was simple. Private Slovik received a legal trial under military law. He was convicted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He had access to appeals, which were denied. The execution was carried out according to proper procedure. While the circumstances are tragic, I cannot overturn a legally valid military conviction simply because only 1 deserter out of many thousands was executed. That would be pardoning the crime, not the sentence. Reagan was technically correct. Slovik's trial had been legal, his conviction valid, his execution procedurally proper. But morally, the question remained. Was it just to execute Slovik when 21,000 others weren't executed? And if it wasn't just, what did that say about American military law? Antoinette Slovik died in 1979, 8 years before Reagan denied the pardon request. She never saw her husband's name cleared. Edward Slovik remains to this day the only American soldier executed for desertion during World War II. His grave in Plot E of the Oise Ain American Cemetery still has no marker, just a number, 96. But in 2017, 72 years after the execution, something unexpected happened. A historian named Christoph Westphal was researching World War II desertion cases and discovered a document that had been classified until 2012. It was a memorandum from General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, to General Eisenhower, dated January 15, 1945, 16 days before Slovik's execution. The memo read, "Regarding the Slovik execution order, I understand the strategic necessity, but I urge you to consider commutation. Executing 1 deserter when 21,000 others are imprisoned creates a legal and moral inconsistency that will haunt us after the war. The deterrent effect is questionable. Soldiers don't desert because they think they'll get away with it. They desert because they've reached their breaking point. Execution punishes the symptom, not the cause. I recommend commuting to life imprisonment." Eisenhower had overruled Marshall. The execution went forward. This discovery changed everything. It proved that Eisenhower had been explicitly warned about the moral problems with Slovik's execution, warned by the Army's top officer, and had proceeded anyway. It proved that the decision wasn't made in the heat of the moment, but after careful consideration of the ethical implications. And it proved that Eisenhower chose strategic necessity over moral consistency. Was he wrong? The question has no answer. Eisenhower was leading millions of soldiers in the bloodiest war in human history. Desertion threatened the entire war effort. He needed discipline, cohesion, obedience. Slovik's signed confession gave him the legal cover to make an example. From a strategic standpoint, the decision was defensible, but from a moral standpoint, executing one man for a crime committed by 21,000 others was arbitrary, unjust, and impossible to defend. Eisenhower knew this. Marshall had told him, and he did it anyway. That's the weight of command. That's the burden of making impossible choices under impossible circumstances. That's what it means to be responsible for millions of lives and to know that every decision you make will haunt you forever. Edward Slovik was executed on January 31st, 1945. He was 24 years old. He'd been in combat for exactly 24 days. He'd fired his rifle exactly 0 times. He'd killed exactly 0 enemy soldiers. And he became the only American soldier executed for desertion in World War II, while 21,000 others went to prison and eventually went home. Was it just? No. Was it legal? Yes. Was it necessary? Eisenhower thought so. Did it work? No. Desertion rates barely changed, and the execution created a moral stain on American military justice that persists to this day. Was there a better choice? Almost certainly. But Edward Slovik wrote his confession, refused to recant, and forced the army to choose between mercy and discipline. And in December 1944, with the Battle of the Bulge raging and American casualties mounting, the army chose discipline. Slovik died for it. And nobody, not Wilson, not Eisenhower, not the 21,000 deserters who survived, not the historians who studied the case for decades, ever found a way to make that choice feel right. The paperwork for Eddie Slovik's execution filled exactly 347 pages, and on February 1st, 1945, one day after the firing squad, a copy of that file landed on the desk of Captain Bernard Altman, a military lawyer in the Judge Advocate General's office in Paris. Altman was 29 years old, from Brooklyn, and he'd spent the last 6 months reviewing court-martial cases for procedural errors. He'd seen dozens of desertion convictions, but he'd never seen an execution order actually carried out, and when he opened Slovik's file and saw the final notation, "Sentence executed 1003 hours, 31st January 1945, Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines," his hands started shaking. Altman spent 3 days reading every document in that file: the confession Slovik had written, the court-martial transcript, the review board decisions, Eisenhower's signature approving the execution, and buried in the middle of the stack, something that made Altman's stomach drop, a list of 48 other soldiers who'd been sentenced to death for desertion since D-Day, 48 death sentences, 48 commutations to prison time, and then Edward Slovik, number 49, who'd actually been shot. Why? Altman started making calls. He contacted the Provost Marshal's office and asked for statistics on desertion convictions. The numbers came back brutal. 21,000 American soldiers convicted of desertion between June 1944 and January 1945. Of those, 2,064 had been court-martialed. Of those, 49 had been sentenced to death. Of those, 48 had been commuted. Only Slovik had been executed. The ratio was insane. 21,000 deserters, 1 execution. That was a 0.048% execution rate. From a statistical standpoint, desertion was one of the safest crimes a soldier could commit. You had a 99.9952% chance of surviving if you deserted. Unless you were Eddie Slovik, in which case you had a 100% chance of dying. Altman wrote a memo to his commanding officer, Colonel David Marcus, laying out the statistical anomaly and asking whether the execution had been legally justified. Marcus read the memo, called Altman into his office, and said, "Captain, you're asking the wrong question. The legal question isn't whether Slovik deserved execution. He was convicted under proper procedure. The legal question is whether executing one deserter out of 21,000 creates a precedent that the army can sustain after the war. And the answer is no, it doesn't. So we're going to bury this case as deep as possible and hope nobody notices. Sir, 21,000 soldiers already noticed, Altman said. Every man in the European theater knows about Slovik by now. You can't bury that. Watch me, Marcus said. And he did. The army classified Slovik's case file as confidential and restricted access to personnel with clearance level 3 or higher. Official casualty reports listed Slovik as died in non-combat circumstances, without elaboration. His widow received a telegram stating that her husband had died in France, but providing no details about how or why. And when reporters started asking questions about desertion rates and whether any soldiers had been executed, the Army's Public Affairs Office responded with carefully worded statements. All courts-martial are conducted according to military law. The Army does not comment on individual cases. It worked for 9 years. Then, in 1954, a journalist named William Bradford Hugh published The Execution of Private Slovik, and the whole story exploded into public consciousness. Americans learned that their government had shot a soldier for desertion while letting 21,000 others go to prison. They learned that Slovik had written a confession and refused to recant. They learned that the execution had been ordered as a deterrent during the Battle of the Bulge, and they learned that the army had tried to cover it up for nearly a decade. The book sold 400,000 copies in its first year. It was serialized in newspapers across the country. It became required reading at West Point and the Army War College. And it forced the military to confront an uncomfortable question. Had the army executed Eddie Slovik for desertion or for being stupid enough to confess? But the real story, the story that didn't come out until decades later, was what happened to the other 21,000 deserters. Most served prison time and were quietly released after the war. The army needed bodies more than it needed to punish cowards, so deserters who'd served 2 or 3 years in military prisons were given general discharges and sent home. No benefits, no GI Bill, no veteran status, but they were alive. A few thousand were given the opportunity to return to combat in exchange for clearing their records. This option was offered in March 1945, after Germany was clearly losing and the army needed replacements. The deal was simple. Go back to the front lines, serve through the end of the war, and your desertion conviction would be expunged. About 3,200 men took the deal. Of those, 417 died in combat between March and May 1945. They died as soldiers, not deserters, and their families received death benefits and military burials. Among those 417 was a private named Joseph Hendricks, who deserted in October 1944, spent 4 months in prison, and volunteered to return to combat in March 1945. He was killed by a sniper in Germany on April 9th, 6 days before Eddie Slovik's execution would have been overturned if the war had ended sooner. Hendricks died as a rehabilitated soldier. His family got a flag and a telegram thanking them for his service. Nobody ever knew he'd deserted. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Hendricks deserted, returned to combat, died fighting, and was honored. Slovik deserted, refused to return, was executed, and was buried in an unmarked grave. The only difference between them was that Hendricks had been willing to give the army another chance, and Slovik hadn't. Was that justice? Or was it just proof that the army cared more about obedience than about fairness? Major John Wilson, the officer who'd commanded Slovik's firing squad, never spoke publicly about the execution. But his private letters, discovered after his death in 1968 and donated to the Army Heritage Center in 1994, revealed the weight he'd carried for 23 years. In a letter to his brother, dated March 15, 1945, 6 weeks after the execution, Wilson wrote, "I shot a man last month. Technically, 12 men shot him, but I commanded the detail, so the responsibility is mine. He was a deserter and a coward, and according to military law, he deserved to die. But here's what bothers me. I've killed dozens of Germans in combat, and I sleep fine. But I can't stop thinking about Slovik. Maybe it's because the Germans were shooting back and Slovik was tied to a post. Maybe it's because the Germans chose to be soldiers and Slovik was drafted. I don't know. All I know is that killing in combat feels different from killing by execution, even when the execution is legal. In another letter, dated November 1945, Wilson wrote, "The war is over. I'm home. My wife asks me what I did in Europe, and I tell her about France and Germany and the medals I received. I don't tell her about Slovik. I'll never tell her about Slovik. Because how do you explain to someone who wasn't there that I killed an American soldier and felt worse about it than killing 50 Germans?" Wilson died of a heart attack in 1968. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer described him as a decorated World War II veteran who served with distinction in Europe. It made no mention of Eddie Slovik, but at Wilson's funeral, one of the men from the firing squad, the young private from Ohio, who'd been given the blank round, approached Wilson's widow and said, "Your husband was a good man. He gave me the blank. He didn't think I could handle killing someone." He was right. Wilson's widow had no idea what the man was talking about. She smiled politely and thanked him for coming. The man left. Wilson's secret stayed buried for another 26 years, until his letters were donated to the archives and researchers discovered the truth. General Eisenhower never publicly expressed regret about approving Slovik's execution, but in private conversations, recorded by his aide and published after Eisenhower's death in 1969, he revealed doubts. In 1958, 13 years after the execution, Eisenhower said, "I approved 49 death sentences during the war. 48 were commuted. 1 was carried out. People ask me why Slovik was different, and the honest answer is timing. His case reached me during the bulge, when desertion was epidemic and I needed to send a message. If the same case had reached me in July 44 or May 45, I would have commuted it. So Slovik died because of when he deserted, not what he did. That's not justice, that's expediency. I sleep fine at night, but some decisions sit heavier than others." In 1963, during a conversation with military historians about wartime leadership, Eisenhower said something more revealing. "Leadership requires you to make choices that no human being should have to make. You send men to die. You approve executions. You sacrifice units to save armies. And the trick, the thing that lets you keep functioning, is convincing yourself that the strategic necessity justifies the moral cost. I convinced myself that executing Slovik would deter desertion. It didn't. Desertion rates barely changed. So I killed a man for strategic reasons, and the strategy failed. What does that make me?" The historian replied, "It makes you a wartime commander, sir." Eisenhower said, "That's not the answer I was hoping for." Antoinette Slovik, Eddie's widow, spent 34 years fighting for a posthumous pardon. She argued that her husband had been mentally ill, that the army had ignored his pleas for help, that executing one deserter out of 21,000 was arbitrary and unjust. She wrote letters to every president from Truman to Carter. She testified before congressional committees. She gave interviews to any journalist who would listen. In 1974, she received a letter from President Gerald Ford. It read, "Mrs. Slovik, I have reviewed your request for a posthumous pardon for your husband, Private Edward Slovik. While I am deeply sympathetic to your situation, I cannot overturn a military conviction that was legally valid at the time it was carried out. Your husband received a fair trial under military law. He was represented by counsel. He had access to appeals. The execution was carried out according to proper procedure. I understand that only one deserter was executed during World War II, and I understand why that seems unjust. But the legal system cannot function if we retroactively invalidate convictions simply because they seem harsh in hindsight. I am sorry for your loss, but I cannot grant your request." Antoinette died in 1979, 5 years after receiving that letter. She was 59 years old. She'd spent more than half her life fighting to clear her husband's name, and she'd failed. But the fight didn't end with her death. In 1981, a veterans advocacy group called the National Association for the Advancement of Justice filed a class action lawsuit arguing that the Army's desertion prosecutions during World War II had been discriminatory. The lawsuit pointed out that of the 21,000 deserters, black soldiers were court-martialed at a rate 3.2 times higher than white soldiers, despite representing only 10% of the Army. The lawsuit also noted that soldiers with criminal records, like Slovik, were disproportionately sentenced to death compared to soldiers without records. The case made it to the Supreme Court in 1987. The court ruled 6-3 that while the statistics suggested bias, there was no evidence of intentional discrimination, and military courts-martial were not subject to the same constitutional protections as civilian trials. Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote a scathing dissent. Today's decision allows the military to execute soldiers based on arbitrary criteria, timing, criminal history, and yes, race, without accountability. Private Slovik was one of 21,000 deserters. He was executed not because his crime was worse, but because his case reached the wrong desk at the wrong time. That is not justice. That is a lottery, and the stakes are life and death. The ruling stood. Eddie Slovik remained a deserter. His grave remained unmarked, and the Army's position remained unchanged. The execution had been legal, proper, and necessary. Then in 2017, something extraordinary happened. A historian named Christoph Westphal was researching declassified World War II documents at the National Archives when he found a memorandum dated January 15, 1945, 16 days before Slovik's execution. The memo was from General George Marshall to General Eisenhower, and it read, "Regarding the Slovik execution order, I understand the strategic necessity, but I urge you to consider commutation. Executing one deserter when 21,000 others are imprisoned creates a legal and moral inconsistency that will haunt us after the war. The deterrent effect is questionable. Soldiers don't desert because they think they'll get away with it. They desert because they've reached their breaking point. Execution punishes the symptom, not the cause. I recommend commuting to life imprisonment. The man will spend the rest of his life in a cell, which serves the purpose of punishment without creating a moral stain that the Army will have to defend for decades." Eisenhower had written a response on the memo. "Marshall, I appreciate your counsel, but I disagree. We need a deterrent, and Slovik's confession makes him the ideal case. The execution will proceed as scheduled." The discovery of this memo changed everything. It proved that Eisenhower had been explicitly warned about the moral problems with Slovik's execution, warned by the Army's top general, and had proceeded anyway. It proved that the decision wasn't made in ignorance or haste, but after careful consideration of the ethical implications. And it proved that Eisenhower had chosen strategic expediency over moral consistency, fully aware of what he was doing. Westphal published his findings in the Journal of Military History in 2018. The article went viral. News outlets picked it up. Veterans groups demanded that the Army reopen Slovik's case. Congressional representatives called for hearings. On November 11, 2018, Veterans Day, 73 years after Slovik's execution, the Secretary of the Army issued a statement. The Army acknowledges that Private Edward Slovik was executed under circumstances that, in hindsight, appear unjust. However, his conviction and execution were legal under the military law in effect at the time. While we cannot change history, we can honor all who served, including those whose service ended in tragedy. Effective immediately, Private Slovik's remains will be disinterred from Plot E and reburied in the main section of Weiser Ain American Cemetery with full military honors. His grave will be marked with a standard military headstone. This does not constitute a pardon or an overturning of his conviction. It is simply an acknowledgement that Private Slovik, like all who served, deserves to be remembered. The reburial took place on January 31st, 2019, exactly 74 years after the execution. 3 members of Slovik's extended family attended. So did 2 surviving members of the 109th Infantry Regiment, both in their 90s. And standing at the back of the ceremony, unannounced, was a man named Robert Wilson, the son of Major John Wilson, the officer who'd commanded the firing squad. After the ceremony, Robert Wilson approached the grave. He placed a photograph on the headstone, a picture of his father in uniform, taken in 1944. On the back of the photograph, Robert had written, "Major John Wilson carried this weight for 23 years. I'm giving it back to you. Rest in peace." Today, Eddie Slovik's grave sits in row 3, plot 73 of Was Ein American Cemetery. The headstone reads, Edward D. Slovik, Private, U.S. Army, World War II, 1920-1945. It doesn't mention desertion. It doesn't mention execution. It just lists his name, rank, and dates. Like every other American soldier buried in that cemetery, Slovik is now remembered as someone who served. But here's the final twist. The detail that nobody discovered until 2021, when a graduate student named Sarah Chen was researching post-war desertion statistics for her dissertation at Harvard. Of the 21,000 soldiers convicted of desertion during World War II, 487 re-enlisted after their prison terms ended. They served in Korea, Vietnam, and peacetime garrison duty. Of those 487, 14 received commendations for bravery. 3 earned Bronze Stars, 1 earned a Silver Star. Among them was a former private named Thomas Keller, who deserted in December 1944, served 2 years in prison, was released in 1947, and re-enlisted in 1950 when the Korean War started. Keller fought at Incheon and Chosin Reservoir. He saved 6 wounded men under fire and received the Silver Star. He served 20 years, retired as a Master Sergeant, and died in 1992. His obituary described him as a decorated Korean War veteran and made no mention of his desertion conviction. Keller and Slovik had deserted within 3 weeks of each other. They'd been convicted under the same military code. They'd faced the same court-martial system. The only difference was that Keller's case reached the review board in February 1945 after the Battle of the Bulge had ended and was commuted to prison time. Slovik's case reached Eisenhower in December 1944 at the height of the crisis and resulted in execution. 21 days of difference. That's all that separated a Silver Star from a firing squad. So what's the moral of Eddie Slovik's story? There isn't one. Not really, because the story doesn't have a moral. It has a question, and the question is this. When you execute one person for a crime committed by 21,000, are you delivering justice or just making an example? The army says it was justice. Slovik was convicted under proper procedure, and the execution was legal. Critics say it was scapegoating. Slovik died because his case had the worst timing and because he was stupid enough to write a confession. Eisenhower said it was strategic necessity. He needed a deterrent, and Slovik gave him a legally bulletproof case. Marshall said it was a mistake. The execution created a moral stain that the army would have to defend forever. And Eddie Slovik? He said they weren't shooting him for desertion. They were shooting him for the bread he stole when he was 12 years old. Who was right? All of them. None of them. The truth is that Eddie Slovik was executed because war doesn't care about fairness. War cares about discipline and obedience and sending messages to frightened men who are considering running away from death. Slovik ran. He wrote it down. He refused to take it back. And in December 1944, with American casualties mounting and desertion rates spiking, that made him the perfect example. Was it just? No. Was it legal? Yes. Was it necessary? Eisenhower thought so, and Marshall disagreed, and 73 years later, we still don't know who was right. But we do know this. Eddie Slovik was one of 21,000 deserters. He was the only one executed. And the reason he died while the others lived had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with bad timing, bad luck, and a signed confession that made it impossible for the army to show mercy. That's not a moral, that's just what happened. And sometimes in war, there is no difference between the two. If stories like Eddie Slovik's make you question what justice really meant in World War II, this channel is for you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if this story made you think, and subscribe so you don't miss the next forgotten chapter of American history.